When my grandmother passed away, my family turned into strangers overnight, fighting like vultures over her house and her savings. They all assumed they'd get the biggest share, especially my uncle, who hadn't spoken to her in years. But when the will was finally read, it contained a twist that none of them saw coming, and it taught me everything about who my family really was. Let me start by telling you about my grandmother, because she was the heart of all of this. Her name was Rose, and she was the kindest, sharpest woman I ever knew. She raised 4 children, my mother and her 3 siblings, mostly on her own after my grandfather passed young. She worked hard her whole life, saved carefully, and ended up with a paid-off house and a respectable amount of savings. Nothing extravagant, but enough that, when she got older, it became the thing certain members of my family started circling like sharks. I was close to Grandma Rose in a way the others weren't. After I finished school, I lived nearby, and I spent a lot of time with her. Not because of any money, I want to be clear about that. I genuinely loved her company. We'd have tea, do puzzles, watch her old movies. As she got older and her health declined, I was the one who drove her to doctor's appointments, picked up her prescriptions, helped her with the house, and sat with her on the long evenings when she was lonely. I did it gladly, for years, asking for nothing. Meanwhile, her other children and grandchildren mostly stayed away. My uncle, whom I'll call Richard, was the worst. He'd had some falling out with Grandma a decade earlier and had barely spoken to her since. He didn't call on her birthday. He didn't visit when she was in the hospital. To him, she was less a mother and more an inheritance that hadn't matured yet. When Grandma's health took a serious turn in her final year, something interesting happened. Suddenly, the relatives who had vanished started reappearing. Richard began calling her, all sweetness, asking how she was doing, mentioning how he'd always loved that house. My cousins, who hadn't seen her in years, started dropping by with flowers and lingering glances at her belongings. It was transparent and, frankly, sickening. Grandma saw it too. She was old, not blind. She'd say to me quietly, after they left, "It's funny how people remember they have a mother when she's about to leave them something." When she passed, the grief was real for me. But for some of the others, the grief lasted about as long as it took to start asking about the will. The fighting began almost immediately, before she was even buried. Richard appointed himself the unofficial head of the family and started talking as though the house was already his. He argued that as the eldest son, he deserved the largest share. My cousins started claiming various pieces of furniture and jewelry, sending messages in the family group chat about what was promised to them, most of which was invented. My mother, to her credit, mostly stayed out of it, but even she got pulled into the tension. Within a week, a family that had functioned for decades was at war, and it was all about money. I stayed quiet. I wasn't expecting anything. I'd helped Grandma because I loved her, and I told myself that whatever the will said, I'd be at peace with it. But I'll admit, watching Richard strut around dividing up her life while he hadn't bothered to call her in years, it made my stomach turn. Then came the day of the will reading. We all gathered in the lawyer's office. You could feel the greed in the room. Richard sat front and center, practically rubbing his hands together. My cousins leaned forward. The lawyer, a calm older man who had known my grandmother for decades, opened the file and began to read. And here is where Grandma Rose, even in death, proved she was the sharpest person in any room. The first part of the will distributed small, specific items, sentimental things, to various family members. A watch here, a necklace there. People shifted impatiently, waiting for the real prize, the house and the savings. Then the lawyer read the key passage, and the room went completely silent. Grandma had left her house and the majority of her savings to me. To the granddaughter who had driven her to appointments and sat with her on lonely evenings and asked for nothing. And then the lawyer read a short letter she had written, to be read aloud, explaining why. In it, she wrote, in her own clear voice, that she was leaving the bulk of her estate to me not because she loved me more, but because I was the only one who had shown up when there was nothing to gain. She wrote that she had watched, in her final years, as certain family members rediscovered her only when they sensed an inheritance, and that she would not reward people for pretending to love her at the end after ignoring her for years. She named no one cruelly. She didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who she meant. The reaction was explosive. Richard shot to his feet, red-faced, shouting that it was outrageous, that I had manipulated a confused old woman, that he would contest it. My cousins joined in, accusing me of isolating Grandma and poisoning her against the family. Suddenly, I was the villain, the schemer, the gold digger, all for the crime of having actually loved her. But Grandma had thought of that too. The lawyer calmly explained that she had updated her will more than a year earlier, while of completely sound mind, with his office, with witnesses, and even with a doctor's note attesting to her mental clarity, precisely because she anticipated this exact reaction. She had armored her final wishes against the very people now screaming in that office. There would be no successful contest. She'd made sure of it. The room emptied in anger. Richard stormed out, vowing lawsuits that would never go anywhere and never did. Several relatives stopped speaking to me entirely, which, given that they'd never really spoken to me before either, was not a great loss. Here's the part that matters, though. In the weeks after, I sat alone in Grandma's house, the house she'd given me, and I went through her things. And I found dozens of little notes, photos, and reminders of the time we'd spent together. I realized she hadn't left me the house as a reward. She'd left it to me because it was the place we'd actually shared a life in, and she wanted it to belong to someone who would remember her, not someone who would sell it the week after the funeral. I kept the house. I live in it now. And the relatives who showed their true faces over money, they did me a strange favor. They showed me exactly who they were, so I never have to wonder again. Here's what I learned. Money has a way of revealing people. Grief shows you who truly loved a person, and inheritance shows you who only loved what they could get. My grandmother knew that better than anyone, and with one carefully written will, she made sure that the people who showed up only at the end walked away with exactly what their love was worth. So tell me, was Grandma right to leave almost everything to me and expose the rest of the family? Or should she have just split it evenly to keep the peace? Let me know what you would have done.